Hello everyone, it's very honored to be here. My name is Uta SHODA from南出和ゼミ. The title of my graduation paper is Multicultural Education for Indigenous Peoples in Taiwan. Taiwan is a multicultural society that has various ethnic groups. The people are mainly divided into 4 ethnic groups: Ben-Shenren, White-Shenren, newcomers, and indigenous peoples. Indigenous peoples have lived on Taiwan Island originally before the 17th century. They are 2.47% of the population. Currently, 16 indigenous groups are formally recognized by the government. They are the Austronesian language family. Although the Taiwanese government has tried to improve their environment, there are still inequalities and discrimination against them. Policies for the education of indigenous people in Taiwan often focus on the elements to succeed in society. However, their social cultural matter and their ethnic identity through coexistence with Han people in education are to be more concerned. In this research, I indicate the way to realize coexistence for indigenous students in multicultural education. The education for ethnic minorities has changed with the times in the world. According to James Banks, because of the upsurge of rights recovery movement by ethnic minorities since the 1970s, multiculturalism took the place of assimilation policy, a nation-state in which one culture. This is the phases in the development of ethnic revitalization movements by James Banks. The first phase is characterized by the ethnic polarization and intense identity quest by victimized ethnic groups and single causal explanations. Second one is precondition phase. There are the existence of a history of colonialism, imperialism, racism, institutionalized democratic ideology, and efforts by the nation-state to close the gap between democratic ideas and realities in this phase. Third one is institutionalization phase. Some of the elements that were discussed in previous phases become institutionalized during this phase. The last one is later phase. It is characterized by meaningful dialogue between marginalized and dominant ethnic groups. Banks mentioned several paradigms that respond to these phases and multicultural education. Before discussing the educational policies for indigenous people, I'd like to briefly review their historical background. The series of colonialisms with a large number of human immigrants from foreign countries had made Taiwan a multi-ethnic country. According to Tanoue, in post-war Taiwan policies, there was a friction between Han people, Ben-Shenren, and White-Shenren, and the distinctions between the two groups had important meanings. But these days, ethnic differences between the two groups are getting less important. On the other hand, the ethnic identity of indigenous peoples in Taiwan has heightened more. The various theories about the factors that heighten their ethnic identity are discussed by Ishigaki and Kasahara. For example, the indigenous rights movement following the democratization in the 1980s and the consciousness of Taiwanization. Ishigaki said Taiwan has been an extremely rare case that was an advanced country with indigenous policies outside the former British colonies. The policy toward the indigenous people has been constantly changing. Lin and Chen mentioned that there are 2 turning points as the key to developing indigenous education. The first turning point was around 1986, the time of ending martial law in Taiwan. With the accomplishment of those movements, the way indigenous people are called was changed in Taiwanese society from 山地同胞to 原住民 to 原住民族 with the amendment to the constitution to establish their existence as ethnic groups. Lin and Chen say that the second turning point came when the Education Act for Indigenous People was promoted in June 1998 with great significance. It was the beginning of reforms to indigenous education. Now that we have looked at the background and educational system, I'd like to move on to talk about an actual problem. In May 2023, it made headlines that a high school student in Taichung posted a picture on the poster on Instagram containing discriminatory language against indigenous people. The poster was made for the school festival by the student. Chinese characters meaning savage and words related to indigenous cultures were used in menus. It caused great controversy and criticized on SNS. The School of Taichung stated that when the students discussed the theme of the activity, the teacher offered to dissuade them. However, the students did not expect the seriousness of the situation. For this analysis, I examined the development phases of indigenous movement with multicultural education in Taiwan based on James A. Banks' research. In addition, I analyzed the development of educational law and understand the trends of Taiwanese policies in recent years. Lastly, I analyzed the torchbearers of education that can solve their difficulties for indigenous children. The movement of indigenous peoples in Taiwan follows the flow of global indigenous trends. Taiwan was in the first phase from in 1970s until 1987. At that time, the institutions for indigenous peoples were established and started to raise voices. Around the time when martial law finished in Taiwan in 1987, they went to the next step, the precondition phase. At that time, democratization had rapidly progressed by ending martial law. Yamazaki mentioned electoral system reform, revision of the constitution, and strengthening of Taiwanese independence had progressed simultaneously during that period. It can be estimated that there were gaps for indigenous peoples between democratic ideals and social realities. Around the end of 1990s, Taiwan was in the institutionalization phase. In 1997, the sentence "the state affirms cultural pluralism and shall actively preserve and foster the development of Aboriginal languages and cultures" was added to the Constitution of the Republic of China. In addition, the Education Act for Indigenous People was promoted in June 1998. Here are items that are related to language and cultural education described in the Education Act for Indigenous People, Article 14, 15, 28, and 29. These items occupy a large part of the Education Act for Indigenous Peoples, and it is clear that the Taiwanese government attaches great importance to this issue. In addition to the laws that I mentioned above, the Taiwanese government has tended to allow autonomy for indigenous groups in education in recent years. In 2014, 3 laws on experimental education were passed in Taiwan. That makes it possible for schools to adapt a form of experimental education for indigenous peoples without being bound the laws and regulations and systemic restrictions. Since the Education Act for Indigenous People enactment in 1998, the law has been amended 6 times. The conference on the proposed amendment to Article 10 of the Education Act for Indigenous People was conducted in 2020. Not only Article 10 but also issues related to Indigenous education and culture were discussed in the conference. One of the members mentioned that the main elements of our own Taiwanese culture currently exist in Indigenous and Hakka cultures. In addition, although the other members raised the problem of discrimination for Indigenous students, but the Ministry of Education and Council of Indigenous Peoples only mentioned spreading Indigenous culture as the solution. From the news that happened in a high school in Taichung, it can be said that the torchbearers to improve the educational environment for Indigenous children are teachers and non-Indigenous students. Although the teacher had recognized the problem and become cautious, the picture was posted on Instagram. In addition, the non-Indigenous students used these words without sensibility until being criticized by society. As you can see from this table, the percentage of Indigenous teachers are quite low compared to 2.47% of the total population of the Indigenous people. In the Education Act for Indigenous Peoples, there are several items related to need for Indigenous teachers. Article 31, 32, 33, and 34. However, they are all for Indigenous key schools and their teachers. Through the rise of Indigenous identity and the battle among the ideas and democracy, Taiwan is in the institutionalization phase now. Although there are constant amendments to educational laws and discussions between the government of the Republic of China and the Council of Indigenous Peoples, the situation is stagnant. From the news high school in Taichung, there is a sentence when students discussed the theme, the teacher pointed out the problem in the news on the internet. Teachers and students had to take the situation more seriously. The government has tried to increase the number of Indigenous teachers only for the succession of traditional culture. However, Indigenous teachers are needed not only at Indigenous schools but also at general schools in non-Indigenous areas. In addition to that, it will be also effective to conduct training for teachers in active service as a way to get results soon and to improve the current situation. In terms of their language and cultural education, policies that respect the autonomy of Indigenous peoples are being implemented and traditions are being actively passed down in various places in Taiwan. The sections of education law show the fulfillment of Indigenous cultural education. According to Ishigaki, they have particular features in that Indigenous rights are emphasized as a key to differentiate Taiwan from mainland China in the complex relationship of the one country two systems with mainland China. At a meeting to amended Article 10 of the Education Act for Indigenous Peoples, one of the members mentioned that the main elements of our own Taiwanese culture currently exist in Indigenous and Hakka cultures. There are many measures in place to ensure cultural inheritance because the Indigenous culture is necessary for non-Aboriginal. However, the biased future-oriented policy leaves the current children behind. Although cultural education is important, important to grow a positive ethnic identity and succeed in their traditions, it is needed to conduct policies that focus on both the future and current students' problem. Cultural education is comparatively easy because it does not interfere with other ethnic. However, fundamental changes in the external environment are required, such as changing perceptions of unconscious prejudice as the support to adapt to differences among students who have other ethnicities. In conclusion, changing the consciousness of non-Indigenous students and non-Indigenous teachers and Indigenous teachers for non-Indigenous area is needed. The problems faced by current Indigenous children are left behind to focus only on the inheritance of Indigenous culture, which is a non-continental element that emphasizes Taiwan for non-Indigenous people. I believe they can go to the next phase if the government conducts the policy involving other ethnic people without limit to cultural education. I hope children who have roots in Indigenous groups can take their identity positively without suffering in the multicultural society of Taiwan. Thank you for listening. 2022年の9月から半年間台湾に留学していて、そこで出会ったルームメイトが原住民族の子で、その子の影響でこのテーマを選びました。最初自分が描いてたものとは若干違う方向にはなったんですけど、これから院でする研究のベースになるのではないかなと思っています。もちろん英文学科の授業も充実してたし、他にもたくさんいろいろな機会をいただけてすごい充実した4年間だったと思います。私は大学院に進学して人類学の勉強を続ける予定です。
はい、ありがとうございました。
ありがとうございます。はい。